We're going through the book of Daniel on Sunday mornings at the moment, and this morning is the last in our series. Oh, I don't know about you, but I'm going to miss Daniel and his quest for spiritual excellence that we've been seeking to understand and unpack during this last term or so. And I want to thank so many of you who've said it's been good to get into a book like this. I was talking to a man only this week who said to me, do you know, the last time I read Daniel was 40 years ago. And he's been thrilled to get back into this book, to seek to understand what God is saying, even though sometimes it's very difficult to get our heads round it. And even Daniel found it difficult to get his head round it. So you're in good company. However, there are things here that are given for us to understand and to help us to grow in Christ and to live for him. And so as we come to the end of this story, I want to look today at the God who winds things up. Now, I use that phrase deliberately because I think it has a double meaning. On one hand, we're going to be looking at the God who makes sure the end is coming and tells us that there will be a day of consummation when his sovereignty will be revealed for what it really is. Now, the other way we use the word, I'm going to wind it up, is when you start to get under somebody's skin. I remember when our kids were young, sometimes Rosie would come in and she'd say, "Oh, she didn't have to wind me up." And occasionally that might happen in church to me. And I might go home and say, "Oh, so-and-so didn't half wind me up." Wild horses wouldn't drag out any instance when that happens, but my friends, it does occasionally. You never know. Your husband, my wife's husband and your pastor is only human after all. God gets under people's skin. And we've seen that time and time again in the book of Daniel, as he has asserted his authority over and above the authorities of the king or of the prime ministers or of the other people involved in the affairs of state. We have a God who winds things up. And so in this last session, this last study, I want us to look back at the main message of the book of Daniel, and it is this: that God is sovereign. And the particular way we want to see that this morning, and I'd like you to see it in the passage that we looked at, is he is sovereign and therefore we can be strong. That's my vision for this morning, to inspire you with that truth, that God is sovereign for you and for me as much as he was for Daniel, and because of that we can be strong in him. Now, you had some notes on the way in, I think. I hope you had a little sheet. You can find a pen and you can sketch in the gaps. I think that one is already there and you can write it down if it isn't. So let's look at the mega story, the big picture of what's going on here. In the children of Israel, or the people of Israel, God has allowed the absolutely unthinkable to happen. He promised his people a land of their own, a land where they could grow and worship and live by his laws and enjoy the huge benefits of having God as their unseen king and close companion. And that's what he wants to be for us too. Our unseen king and our close companion. But God's people had let the dark side of human nature dominate. And they had unleashed the beast in the basement and ignored their God. They'd fallen into wrongdoing. And so God found himself with no alternative but to let them be invaded and go into exile, with the hope and expectation that they would one day return to him and return to their land. Now, for the people, the Jewish people, the God followers, the God fearers in exile, who had any spiritual awareness or concern, they would have wondered, does God still care about me? Has he abandoned us? Is God still in control? Or have we been left completely to our own devices? And the book of Daniel is about the life of one exceptional man who was convinced that God had not abandoned them, that God had not lost his power or abdicated his authority. And some aspects of this book have always been popular. You know, the three men being saved from the burning fiery furnace, and Daniel surviving the den of lions, and the strange handwriting on the wall at Belshazzar's feast. But what we've seen as we've been looking through this book is much more than just exciting stories. That the principles that Daniel lived by have a highly contemporary resonance. They applied then and they still apply today. Let me give you 4 very brief examples. I'm not sure whether I've got these on the screen or not. God allowed the unthinkable to happen. No, I haven't. You'll have to write these down. Here we go. First of all, the first example is when the king tried to re-educate Daniel. Daniel faced moral compromise, but he quietly but determinedly stood up for his faith, for the high values that he espoused in national life, and said, I want to follow God rather than the king. And when there is a conflict between following the Lord and following the monarch, it is the Lord who is Lord. That's how he is Lord. And today we are encouraged to think that God is out of date or irrelevant, that rationalism is the only intellectually tenable way of looking at the universe. Actually, it is not. It is perfectly reasonable and intellectually tenable to believe in God and trust him with our lives. I would love to unpack that a bit more, but we don't have time this morning. It is perfectly valid to trust God. The idea that science has disproved God is completely untenable. We can undermine it very quickly indeed. But the king tried to re-educate Daniel and get him to think differently, as we are encouraged to think differently. But quietly he stood for God, and God honoured him in that stand. Second example is Daniel was bullied by his boss. And you may remember when we looked at Daniel chapter 2, how we saw the way in which a bully operates. And we picked out some of the principles of facing bullying, whether in the family, in society, or in the workplace, wherever it takes place. The third example is Daniel was demoted, but he never became bitter. And many of us have experienced periods of deep disappointment, even been demoted in life, or we've been moved sideways in our job, or someone has jumped a rung or two and beaten us to it, and we feel bitter and disappointed. But Daniel faced exactly that, and he didn't allow that disappointment to define him. We'll come on to that in a moment. And then the fourth example of Daniel's resilience is when he was betrayed by people he thought were his friends. It was that which landed him on the floor of the lion's den. He was betrayed by people with whom he was working closely. And even in that moment, he trusted God with his life. And the message that comes over time and time again here is God is sovereign. He's still on the throne, no matter whoever or however powerful, either politically or militarily, that our opponents are. God is still on the throne. Now, if the first part of the book tells us that God is on the throne in the here and now, then the second half is there to tell us that God is on the throne in the future as well. Nothing takes him by surprise. Now, while we've been going through this series, and I've been preaching on Daniel, several people have asked me about the prophecies, the prophetic interpretation of Daniel, and I have deliberately not majored on trying to fit individual future events to specific verses in Daniel. Events in the past, yes, because we can look back on them, their history. We can see how uncannily precise Daniel's predictions were. So why not the future? Partly because, my friends, I'm not convinced that's why Daniel wrote the book. I don't think he intended his book to be used as a conundrum, to be solved by well-intentioned futurologists. He had a much bigger purpose than that. Just try and sit yourself, if you can, in the shoes of one of the first people, or the sandals, of one of the first people who would have read Daniel. What would you hear if you were hearing this for the first time? Well, Daniel starts talking about his past, those 6 events from his autobiography. Then we hear Daniel talking about the future, making some prophetic observations about God and history. And these prophetic observations contain enough detail for us to pin them down, but only because they are in our past, not Daniel's. You get the point? Here's a timeline. Here's ancient, there's future. Daniel is here, and he's looking back on his past, encouraging people with the events that have taken place, but he's looking forward to the future, and he can't see clearly what's happening. But those events, they took place around here. So we are here up in the future looking back on it, and we can very clearly identify what Daniel is talking about. In fact, so clearly that some people have suspected that the book of Daniel is cheating, and it was written about here. But we dealt with that a few weeks ago. Okay, so Daniel is talking about the future. And if these predictions become reality, then that confirms to me that God is sovereign. He's still on the throne. And it's that message that energizes us to trust him today, to lay our lives at his disposal, as Daniel did, no matter what happens. So let's just move on to talk for a moment about Daniel. Those were the things. There are. He expects to change, thinking he was bullied, he was demoted, and he was betrayed. Sorry, I did have them up on the screen. You can tell I've just arrived from a camp and haven't quite got all my PowerPoints printed in front of me to know where we are. But have you got those? Yes. Or do you want me to run over them again? There you are. I think you've got a heading, The Stunning Prophet. And what I want to do here is just to alert you to the remarkable accuracy of the prophecies that we have in this passage, chapters 11 and 12, that we're looking at today. Verse 2 of chapter 11. 3 kings will appear in Persia and then a fourth. And as we look at history, we can see who those 3 kings were. Cambyses in 530, Gaumata in 522, and Darius I again later in 522. And the fourth king is Artaxerxes. Verse 3, a mighty king will appear who will rule with great power. And so we can go on, attaching very clear historic detail to the prophecies of Daniel in chapter 11. Then we notice that he makes prophecies about the king of the south. And here we move to Egypt and Syria. Verse 5, the king of the south will become strong, and one of his commanders will become even stronger, and he will rule his kingdom with great power. Now we can observe that this king of the south is Ptolemy in Egypt, and it wasn't long before Seleucus, one of Egypt's satraps, rose in power and asserted independence in the northern part of Egypt, and the clock has now reached about 300 BC. And so if we look at the details in this chapter from verse 2 to verse 35, we can pick out individual events in history that mark the major points that Daniel saw in his prophetic vision. And so it goes on. You can do the same in chapter 12. I will leave you to do that for yourself if you want to. There is plenty in the commentaries, and there's also some fairly good stuff out on the internet, but do be careful what you read about Daniel on the internet, because you will also encounter not only the sane and sensible, but you will find the wild and wacky. So, what we notice here, come back to our message, is that kings rise and fall. And as we go through this chapter 11 and into chapter 12, we see a verb that comes up time and time again. It's the verb amad, and it means to be strong or to stand firm. And he talks about kings who rise and fall. And the message we're hearing from these events in Daniel is kings may stand up and be strong, but there will come a moment when they will all fall down. Some of you will remember the politician Enoch Powell. He once said this: the danger of a political career is that it is bound to end in failure. Someone will catch you and vote you out at some point in your life. In contrast, God is on the throne and is never going to be removed. And there's more. One of these kings, whom we can identify as Antiochus Epiphanes, that we looked at a few weeks ago, he deliberately usurped the worship of God by setting up a public idol, probably in the temple itself, and it's described as the abomination that causes desolation, absence from God. It was both a historic act and a prophetic statement, and Jesus talked about this happening in the New Testament. Whereas other kings stand and then fall, at this point something very different happens. And this is where I want you to have one key verse to take away from this morning. Go to verse 32 of chapter 11 and you'll hear this. With flattery, Antiochus Epiphanes will corrupt those who have violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will stand up and do exploits. Your version might have firmly resist him or stand firm. Various ways of interpreting this, which we'll come on to in a moment. Firmly resist him in the New International Version is a convenient phrase, but it omits the match with the Hebrew root elsewhere in this chapter of standing firm. So you begin to see the picture. All these other kings, they stand up and they fall down. Their careers come to nothing. But those who know their God will stand up, amad, same verb, and stay standing. They will stand up and do exploits. So let's have a look at these people who are going to stand up and do exploits. Who might they be? Well, Daniel describes them. He says these are the people who know their God. In effect, Daniel here is describing the effect of knowing God. And when we see the verb to know in the Old Testament, obviously we need to interpret it in its context. Everything has to be interpreted in its context. But knowing is a very intimate word. When I say you need to know God, I wonder what comes to your mind. Does it mean, we need to do an extensive study of theology? No, it doesn't, although studying the scriptures always helps. Does it mean we have to go to a particular church to find God? No, it doesn't, although being in fellowship with God's people here or somewhere like it is always going to be vital. Does it mean following certain rituals or worship practices? No, it doesn't, although regularly feeding your heart from God's word in worship with his people will always help you to grow. So what does it mean? In the Old Testament, this word know is even used sometimes, occasionally, of a husband and wife having sex together. It's used to describe the most intimate and deepest of relationships. That's the verb that's used here of these people who know their God. They are intimate with him. They understand him. They've been walking with him. They've handed their lives to him in just the same way as he's made a covenant with you and me. Carries the idea of a personal, regular knowledge of the Lord. And that's why teaching and soaking our minds in God's word is so vital, because it helps us to not just know about him, but know him. And there's a chasm of a difference between knowing about somebody and really knowing them. So what happens with these people who know their God? Well, Daniel goes on to say, they will be strong. Here's our word. They stand up. The strength that we have in mind here is not physical prowess. It's a deep strength of heart and mind and personality and spirit that says, Lord, I will trust you whatever. Do you remember Daniel's three friends who were thrown into the burning fiery furnace? They knew that the furnace could reduce them to dust in a matter of minutes. And in that moment, they said two significant things to King Nebuchadnezzar, who had just sentenced them to death by burning. They said, O king, our God is capable of rescuing us from your furnace. You are not the sovereign here. He is. But then they said something fascinating. Even if he doesn't, we will still not bow down to you. We will not bow down to anyone other than the living God. So even if we become martyrs, God is still God. Nebuchadnezzar, I'm sorry, but you are not on the throne. And there is a shining example here of men drawing on the strength that God, knowing God, gives in a dire, violent and unjust moment in life. And we know that 3 men went into the fire. 3 men came out of the fire, but there were 4 men in when they looked at the burning. They were rescued. Many other martyrs are not. So whatever was about to happen, these men were going to be strong in God. And we know, my friends, there are times when we as God's people need to be strong in him. We need to dig deep in our personal resources, and we discover that he gives us strength in the inner man. And if that's you today, my friend, if you're facing a trial or a difficulty that you know in your own strength you can't face, take this verse with you. Those who know their God will be strong and do exploits. So let's come on to that final phrase, final part of Daniel's word here. Those who know their God will be strong and do exploits. Well, there are various translations here, because it's kind of a difficult Hebrew sentence to get all the nuances in English. Some of you will have do exploits, some will take action. Whatever English words we use, the message is clear. Those of us who know our God, draw on his strength, will be able to do things that may not have otherwise been possible. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, said Paul. A fairly close English equivalent, I think, is the word proactive, and we talk about this word. It has an interesting history. It began in the 1930s as a technical term in psychology. But in the 1940s, there was a very influential book published by this man. It's called Viktor Frankl. And it's a book called Man's Search for Meaning. Now, Frankl had been caught by the Nazis and imprisoned in Auschwitz and several other concentration camps. He was moved around a bit. And finally, in 1944, he was taken to the infamous Auschwitz camp. And was rescued when the camp was liberated by Allied soldiers. Frankl was a psychologist, and he was intrigued by the differences between people who survived the Holocaust and even thrived in the concentration camps, and those who, although released, allowed the experience to break them. And he used this word to describe the survivors, the people who took responsibility for their own lives rather than looking for causes outside of themselves for their sadness and difficulty. He called them proactive people. Something within them that caused them to face hardship and overcome it. Proactive people experience hardship and say, recovery is possible and it's my responsibility. I'll do my best to get on with it, however deep I need to dig. People who are not proactive experience hardship and say, I can't cope. It's all someone else's fault. I will look for someone to blame. Now, while that's a rather sweeping generalisation, and I know given more time we'd love to be a bit more precise about it, but that's the general broad brush picture that he paints. And he noticed that the proactive people were the survivors by and large. They were the creatives, and very often they were the leaders. That's the idea behind doing exploits that we have in this Hebrew word here. The kingdom of God is grown by people who will grow it. It's a prompt for all of us not to let things slide in our walk with God. It's the people who know their God and who therefore have strength to draw on to make his kingdom grow and will be resilient when tough times come. And they will for all of us. Those who know their God will be strong and do exploits. My friend, if you want to take one verse away from the book of Daniel, take that one. Because Daniel was a man who knew God, just as we can know him. Daniel was a man who stood up in the strength God gave him. And Daniel was a man who was proactive. He did exploits in God's name. Are you facing some unknown future? If you are, my friend, God is still on the throne. Are you facing moral compromise at work, or in your family, or in some other sphere of life? If you are, then God is still on the throne. And you can be one of these people who stands and achieves exploits. Are you facing danger or even violence? is still on the throne. And you can be one of these people who stands firm and takes action or does exploits. In the New Testament, Paul put it like this. You might like to make a note of that verse. I don't know whether I've printed it in your notes. Therefore, brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that labour in the Lord is not in vain. Those who know their God will be strong and do exploits. Let's bow